Hello, you are listening to the podcast associated with the PowerPoint What is Revision? Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what revision is and kind of dealing with some of the misconceptions that people have about what revision is. The first 6 slides I'm actually just going to read. They come directly from the University of North Carolina Writing Center, and it has to do with some misconceptions. So it's basically in a question-answer format, and the first question is, what is revision? Revision literally means to see again, to look at something from a fresh critical perspective. It is an ongoing process of rethinking the paper, reconsidering your arguments, reviewing your evidence, refining your purpose, reorganizing your presentation, and reviving stale prose. Notice that all of those elements are a little bit more involved and aren't just simply something that you can do in just a couple of minutes. The second slide asks, but I thought revision was just fixing the commas and spelling. And the answer is nope. That's called proofreading. It's an important step before turning your paper in, but if your ideas are predictable, your thesis is weak, and your organization is a mess, then proofreading will just be putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. When you finish revising, that's the time to proofread. Notice then that there's a step that comes before you get to those things like commas and spelling. And even those are things that we often like to work with first because they seem easier. They're not very useful if you're working with a draft that is missing bigger concerns, like maybe it's not addressing the actual purpose of the assignment, or maybe your organization is just in need of a lot of help. Sentence level concerns aren't as useful at that point. The third slide asks, what if I just reword things, look for better words, avoid repetition, etc.? Is that revision? It answers, well, that's a part of revision called editing. It's another important final step in polishing your work, but if you haven't thought through your ideas, then rephrasing them won't make any difference. This is an important step, but not the one to start with, and we'll talk about that more in these next slides. On the fourth slide it says, whoa, I thought I could just revise in a few minutes. And it answers, sorry. You will want to start working on your revisions early so that you have plenty of time for revising. That way you can give yourself some time to come back to look at what you've written with a fresh pair of eyes. It's amazing how something that sounded brilliant the moment you wrote it can prove to be less than brilliant when you give it a chance to incubate. That can also be useful for things like if you're working with a complex idea and the way that you word it seems really, really clear the first time you write it, but maybe you walk away from it for 20 minutes, an hour, or even a day or so, and when you come back it's not nearly as clear. That's why you want to give yourself time to revise issues like that. The fifth slide then says, but I don't want to rewrite my whole paper. And it answers, revision doesn't necessarily mean rewriting the whole paper. Sometimes it means revising the thesis to match what you've discovered while writing. Sometimes it means coming up with stronger arguments to defend your position, or coming up with more vivid examples to illustrate your points. Sometimes it means shifting the order of your paper to help the reader follow your argument, or to change the emphasis of your points. Sometimes it means adding or deleting material for balance or emphasis. And then, sadly, sometimes revision does mean trashing your first draft and starting from scratch. Better that than having the teacher trash your final paper. And again, remember that's from someone else's site. But they do bring up a good point, that if you aren't considering the concerns of the assignment when you're doing your revision, then taking care of those smaller concerns like spelling and commas and the things that we like to think of as parts of revision, then you're not doing yourself any favors. Think about how some of the stuff could have been useful for that workshop draft that we looked at online over this past week. For example, that first part where it says sometimes it means revising the thesis to match what you've discovered while writing. It seemed like that author for the workshop example that we looked at started off with a pretty strong position and then kind of waffled back and forth between those two positions, and the thesis ultimately didn't match up with their argument that they had written. So things like revision with time and space to get that done could be a good time to fix that and then make your paper match up with your thesis, which is a much more important concern than in that section though, for that A1 example, just messing with commas. Okay, so now that we have a sense of what revision is, or at least what it should be, we're going to talk about some strategies that you might consider for revising your A1 draft. Because revision is an important part of writing a paper, I'm going to ask that you guys do a revision plan for each paper that you turn in. And those will be plans that help you think about the nuts and bolts of each assignment that you're turning in, what you'll do to revise it. So these are some strategies for revision that could come in for the revision plan during the how section of that, where it says how do you plan on revising this and what new tactics are you going to try. I'm going to give you some suggestions for strategies for revision. Some may be familiar to you, some might not be so familiar. Try to pick one that's not so familiar to you and plan on trying that this week. So the strategies for revision that you might choose from are: number 1, start by focusing on the big picture. Number 2, work from a hard copy. Number 3, read out loud. And number 4 is my personal favorite, don't be afraid to cut. Okay, so the first revision strategy that I brought up is called start by focusing on the big picture. That helps you to remember to focus on those larger concerns like we talked about in the revision section earlier, rather than those small concerns like sentence level problems. So some questions that you might consider asking yourself that come from the Hobart and William Smith colleges are things like, is the original purpose of the writing fulfilled? Or further down on the slide, does the overall structure seem sensible in terms of your intentions? Keep in mind that these are just some examples of the things that you might ask yourself. Another way to start by focusing on the big picture could be to look at your assignment sheet. Look at the rubric. The things that I put at the top of the rubric are things that I consider to be more important for that assignment, and that can help you focus on larger concerns. If you also go to that next slide, that one's called the hierarchy of rhetorical concerns, and this is something that sometimes we use in rhetoric and composition studies to help us focus on those larger issues. So if you look at that top box, it says audience, purpose, and context. So thinking back to A1, making sure that the paper that you've written really matches the purpose for A1 is a big step in this, right? So if you have a paper that does a really good job of explaining why you agree with your text that you found or why you didn't agree, then it could be really, really beautifully written, but it doesn't address the purpose, since the purpose is supposed to be not whether or not you're agreeing, but whether or not that text is effective for the audience that you believe it's directed toward. So in revision, making sure that you're matching the purpose of the assignment is a good thing to start with if you're stuck. And notice also that in there, toward the bottom, at the very bottom, style, mechanic, and conventions, those are those things like grammar and spelling that sometimes come so easy to us but aren't necessarily that top priority. They're at the bottom for a reason. Don't get to those things until you've considered those other things ahead of it. Okay, the next revision strategy that you might consider trying is working from a hard copy, where you print it off and actually look at something outside your computer on paper. Now that may seem like a very, very simple strategy, and in a lot of ways it is really simple, but it's one of those things that involves some psychology that we don't always think about. So sometimes when you have a draft and it's in your personal computer that belongs to you, it feels like a really personal draft, like that writing is a part of you, and it's really hard to change it. Sometimes if you print it off into a hard copy format, it becomes a little less personal to you, and it's a little bit easier to be more objective about the changes that you need to make, which can help a lot for making good, effective revision. On the other hand, it's a good way to get a sense of some of the errors that are maybe smaller things that you would just never ever see if it's on the screen. For some reason, working on hard copy helps problems just pop right out on the page. So that's a really important strategy that you might consider. The third strategy that you might try for this paper is reading out loud. Again, another strategy that seems really simple but can make a lot of difference if you're trying it. Again, it's a way that you catch mistakes that you don't catch just reading it in your head, because in your head you'll fill in those gaps and things that might not be making clear sense if you read it will just kind of fill in your brain. Reading it out loud will take it out of your brain a little bit, and this is a good strategy too if you feel like you've been staring at this paper for so long that the words don't really mean anything anymore. Trying a new way of getting those words out, such as reading them, can be a good way to break up the monotony a little bit. Even better, if you have someone else around you, like a roommate or a friend, who will read your paper out loud and let you listen to them read it, then you will hear where they're stumbling and you can take notes on where it was difficult or confusing for them to read through the paper. This can really help you with things like organization, transitions, and sometimes things that are smaller like sentence level things. Awkward sentences are a good thing to catch through this. One place that you may consider doing this is usually at the writing center. They'll read through the draft out loud so you can both get a sense, you and the consultant can both get a sense of what's going on in the paper. So if you're looking for someone to help read through the paper with you, that's a great resource. And the final strategy that you might consider for this paper is don't be afraid to cut. Again, this is from the UNC Writing Center, and I'll read this one. If you want to be a polished writer, then you will eventually find out that you can't afford not to throw stuff away. As writers, we often produce lots of material that needs to be tossed. The idea or metaphor or paragraph that I think is most wonderful and brilliant is often the very thing that confuses my reader, or ruins the tone of my piece, or interrupts the organization of my argument. Again, that's from the UNC Writing Center, and I think they bring up a really good point. That many times when you've gotten something written, it feels like you've already done the assignment. So let's say that you have this 2-page assignment, you've written 2 pages, and you're feeling pretty good about that. It's really easy to think, now that I have those 2 pages, I can't let anything go, because if I get up those 2 pages, I just have to rewrite it. But let's say that you have a paragraph that isn't serving the purpose of the assignment, or that doesn't really make sense. So thinking back to that workshop example, there's that section where she says, yes, this is effective, but then the majority of her analysis is how it isn't effective. So she could potentially, the writer, have considered chopping out that first paragraph about how it was effective, or that second chunk, which was even longer, about how it wasn't effective, and then filling in more details and evidence on one side or the other. That would have made this a much stronger draft, and it would have helped her overall assignment. Now, I know what you're thinking, but that means a lot more work. And trust me, revision does involve work, but that's why it's so important, because when you put in more work to a paper, you turn into a better writer, you come out with better pieces of writing. And overall for this class, it's going to help you get a better grade. So you want to schedule the time and you want to plan ahead so that you can have plenty of time for revision. That's again why we're going to do these revision plans. So if you have any questions on revision, please contact me. And if you don't for the time being, these are the things that you want to be referring to for that revision plan, which again is in the course content. It's called Revision Plan Questions. So be sure that you're filling out those revision plan questions. You're picking one of these 4 strategies for the how question, and then you're bringing that revision plan in a hard copy format to class on Thursday so that you can turn those in as part of your A1 grade.